Welcome back to Eva's Whisper. Have you ever watched someone try to steal your life right in front of your eyes? Today's story is about the exact moment a wife realized her marriage was a sham, and how a mother-in-law decided it was time to take out the trash. The private dining room at Morton's Steakhouse in Chicago felt like a time capsule of old money and quiet success. The air was thick with the mouth-watering scent of roasted garlic, seared prime rib, and the kind of expensive red wine that costs more than a decent used car. It was supposed to be a celebration. 10 years. A whole decade of marriage for Mark and Sarah. Eleanor and her husband Richard had arrived early, as they always did. At 72 years old, Eleanor had zero patience for being fashionably late. She sat quietly at the corner of the heavy mahogany table, sipping her iced tea with lemon. She watched her son Mark, who was nervously checking his phone every 30 seconds. And then she watched Sarah, her daughter-in-law, who looked absolutely radiant in a simple, understated navy dress. Eleanor loved Sarah. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when Mark's business was nothing but a pipe dream drawn on a napkin. It was Sarah who worked double shifts. It was Sarah who clipped coupons, managed the household budget, and made sure every extra dime went into a conservative index fund so they would not end up broke. She was the backbone of their financial security long before the big money started rolling in. Sarah smiled at her in-laws and gently patted Mark on the shoulder. She leaned down and whispered that she was going to run to the powder room to wash her hands before the appetizers arrived. Mark barely looked up from his phone, just giving a distracted nod. Eleanor watched Sarah walk out the heavy oak doors, feeling a sudden, sharp pinch of irritation at her son. He was acting like a jittery teenager, not a man celebrating a decade of partnership with the woman who built him. But nothing could have prepared Eleanor for what happened exactly 2 minutes later. The heavy oak doors swung open again, but it was not Sarah. A young woman breezed into the private dining room like she owned the entire restaurant. She was maybe 25, wearing a dress that was entirely too short for a family dinner, and trailing a cloud of heavy, sickeningly sweet floral perfume that immediately fought a war with the smell of the roasted garlic. Slung over her arm was a designer leather handbag that Eleanor instantly recognized. It was a bag that cost at least $4,000, the kind of money that used to cover Mark and Sarah's mortgage for 2 months. The girl did not even pause to introduce herself. Without missing a single beat, she marched right up to the head of the table and plopped herself down directly into Sarah's empty, reserved chair next to Mark. Eleanor almost choked on her iced tea. Richard stopped buttering his bread roll, his bushy eyebrows shooting up to his hairline in pure confusion. Mark looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack right there into his water glass. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He fumbled with his phone, nearly dropping it on the hardwood floor, and started stammering so hard he could barely form a coherent sentence. He jumped up, waving his hands in a frantic, jerky motion. "Mom! Dad!" he choked out, his voice cracking. This is Tiffany. She is a crucial junior consultant from the firm. She was just in the neighborhood and needed to drop off some urgent files." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Her internal nonsense detector, sharpened by 50 years of marriage and decades of managing her own finances, went off like a 5-alarm fire. She looked at Tiffany's hands. There were no files. There was no briefcase. Just a fresh manicure and that ridiculously expensive bag. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with the kind of polite ice that only older Southern women and Chicago matriarchs can truly master. "It is fascinating that a junior consultant works so late on a Friday night, and without any paperwork, no less." Tiffany let out a loud, braying laugh that grated on Eleanor's nerves. "Oh, we are always grinding, Mrs. Davis. Mark and I just have this crazy synergy at the office. We never stop. She reached over and actually put her hand over Mark's wrist. Mark flinched, his eyes darting toward the door in sheer panic. And that was the exact moment Sarah walked back in. The temperature in the private room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. Sarah froze, her hand still resting on the brass handle of the oak door. She took in the scene. Her husband, sweating profusely. A strange, flashy woman sitting in her chair, the hand resting on his wrist. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. It was like watching a train wreck happen in slow motion. Eleanor held her breath, waiting to see what her son would do to fix this incredible disrespect. He did nothing. He just stood there, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice. Sarah took a slow, deep breath. She walked toward the table, her head held high, though Eleanor could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Excuse me?" Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady. "I believe you are sitting in my seat." Tiffany did not even blink. She slowly pulled her hand back from Mark, turning to look Sarah up and down with a sickly, sweet, patronizing smile that made Eleanor want to reach across the table and slap her. "Oh, you must be Sarah," Tiffany said, completely ignoring the request to move. "I hope you do not mind me crashing for a minute. Mark always says how totally chill you are about his long hours and his crazy schedule. I just knew you would be cool with it." The audacity hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She was daring Sarah to make a scene. She was testing the waters, asserting her dominance right in front of Mark's parents. Eleanor gripped her cloth napkin under the table until her knuckles turned white. She watched her daughter-in-law. She knew Sarah. Sarah was a class act. She would never subject Eleanor and Richard to a screaming match in the middle of a high-end steakhouse. She respected family too much for that. Sarah stared at Tiffany for a long, agonizing moment. Then she looked at Mark. The disappointment in her eyes was heavy enough to crush stone. Mark swallowed hard, completely incapable of meeting his wife's gaze. He looked down at his shoes like a guilty child. Without saying another word, Sarah turned around. She walked over to the corner of the room, picked up a heavy, spare wooden chair, and dragged it over to the edge of the table. She wedged herself in at the corner, far away from her husband, and gently laid her napkin across her lap. "Please," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. "Do not let me interrupt the synergy." Tiffany smirked, leaning back comfortably in Sarah's chair, looking like the cat that ate the canary. Mark nervously flagged down a waiter, desperately trying to order a strong drink. But Eleanor just sat there in the dim light, studying the interloper. Tiffany thought she had just won a major victory. She thought she had marked her territory and established herself as the alpha in the room. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that Eleanor legally controlled the purse strings to Mark's entire operation. And she certainly had no idea that Eleanor was about to turn this anniversary dinner into an absolute nightmare for anyone who dared to disrespect her family. The heavy oak doors swung open again, this time admitting a procession of waiters dressed in crisp white jackets. They carried massive silver trays, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the private dining room. Plates of oysters on a bed of crushed ice were set down, followed by thick wedge salads drenched in creamy blue cheese dressing and topped with generous slabs of smoked bacon. Normally, this was the part of the evening where Richard would crack a joke about his cholesterol, and they would all laugh and clink their wine glasses. Not tonight. Tonight, the only sound was the clinking of heavy silverware and the incredibly annoying sound of Tiffany's voice. She had not stopped talking since Sarah had dragged that wooden chair to the corner of the table. And she was not just making small talk. She was putting on a full corporate presentation. acting like she was the mastermind behind Mark's entire company. "Honestly, Mark and I have been completely consumed with scaling the business," Tiffany said, stabbing a cherry tomato with her fork. "We are talking major expansion. It is all about finding that perfect synergy, you know? We have been analyzing the Q3 projections, and I told Mark, we cannot afford to lose momentum. We have to keep grinding. You sleep when you are dead, right?" She looked around the table, waiting for applause that was never going to come. Richard was staring at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Eleanor chewed her salad slowly, her face an unreadable mask, though inside she was seething. She knew exactly what it took to scale that business. It took Sarah eating canned soup for 3 years and Eleanor co-signing a massive loan. It certainly did not take some 20-something consultant talking about synergy over expensive oysters. Mark, for his part, looked like a man standing on the gallows. He had flagged down a passing waiter and furiously whispered an order. Less than a minute later, a fresh double scotch on the rocks was placed in front of him. He did not even bother to sniff it. He just picked up the heavy crystal glass and took a massive gulp, the amber liquid burning down his throat. "So, how about those bears?" Mark blurted out suddenly, his voice way too loud for the intimate room. "I mean, they are really trying to rebuild the offensive line this season." "Dad, did you see the game on Sunday?" Richard opened his mouth to answer, desperate to grab onto the lifeline his son had just thrown. But Tiffany just rolled her eyes and rested her manicured hand on Mark's forearm again. "Oh, sweetie, nobody cares about football right now," she purred, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "We are talking about our future. We are talking about securing the bag." Eleanor felt a muscle tick in her jaw. Did she just call my son sweetie? In front of his wife? In front of his parents? Tiffany turned her attention away from Mark and zeroed in on Sarah. Sarah had barely touched her food. She was sitting quietly in her corner exile, perfectly composed on the outside, but Eleanor could see the white-hot fury burning in her eyes. "So, Sarah," Tiffany said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Mark tells me you are a stay-at-home mom. That must be nice. Just relaxing all day, running a few errands, doing the school drop-offs." Sarah met Tiffany's gaze evenly. "I take care of our 2 children, yes. And I manage the household." Tiffany let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "That is so cute. I mean, I could never do it. I would absolutely lose my mind being stuck in a house all day. I need the hustle. I need to be out there in the trenches, making things happen. The real financial grind, you know?" Sarah did not take the bait. She just took a sip of her water, keeping her voice completely neutral. "It is hard work, just a different kind of hard work." "Well, sure," Tiffany said, waving her hand dismissively. "But let us be real. In today's economy, you have to be smart about wealth management. You cannot just rely on one person to bring home the bacon while you sit back and relax. You have to understand asset allocation, compound interest, how to build a real safety net for retirement. Mark and I talk about this all the time. He was so stressed about his retirement portfolio before I came along and helped him strategize. You really have to know what you are doing to secure a comfortable future." Eleanor almost laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated nerve of this girl. Here she was, giving a condescending financial lecture to the very woman who had single-handedly built the foundation of her husband's wealth. Sarah had forgotten more about compound interest than this girl would ever learn. When Mark was practically bankrupt from his first failed business venture, it was Sarah who sat at their tiny kitchen table until 3 a.m, aggressively balancing spreadsheets, ruthlessly cutting expenses, and investing every single penny of her waitressing tips into a conservative mutual fund. Sarah did not need a lecture on the financial grind. She was the financial grind. Mark took another desperate gulp of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the glass in the quiet room. He was sweating right through his expensive, tailored suit. He looked at Sarah, silently begging her not to blow up. He wanted her to just take the insult. He wanted her to sit there and be humiliated by his mistress so he would not have to deal with the awkwardness of defending her. His cowardice was breathtaking. It was a physical weight in the room. Eleanor watched Sarah's hands. They were resting in her lap, hidden by the heavy white tablecloth. But Eleanor could see the fabric pulling tight. Sarah was gripping her cloth napkin so hard her knuckles were completely white. She was holding on to it like a lifeline, using every ounce of willpower she possessed to keep from throwing her plate of oysters directly at Tiffany's perfectly contoured face. "You know," Tiffany continued, completely oblivious to the radioactive tension she was generating, "most women in your position, Sarah, they just bury their heads in the sand. They let their husbands do all the heavy lifting and then act surprised when things go south. I always tell Mark he is so lucky to have someone like me at the firm who actually understands the reality of the market. It takes a lot off his plate. Does it not, Mark?" Mark choked on his drink. He coughed violently, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, grabbing a napkin to wipe his mouth. "Yeah," he wheezed. "Sure." It was pathetic. Eleanor felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over her. She looked at her son, the boy she had raised to be a man of integrity, and she did not recognize him at all. He had traded in a brilliant, loyal partner for a cheap thrill who was currently insulting the mother of his children right to her face. Sarah let go of the napkin. She slowly placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at Tiffany, and then she looked at Mark. She did not yell. She did not cry. But the silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was the silence of a woman who had just realized that the man she spent 10 years building a life with was not worth the chair he was sitting in. And as the waiter came around to clear the appetizer plates, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself. If Mark was not going to defend his wife, then his mother certainly would. And she was going to make sure it hurt. The waiters moved silently around the heavy mahogany table, clearing away the half-eaten wedge salads and the empty oyster shells. Richard leaned over to his wife, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. He opened his mouth to whisper something, probably to ask why their son was sweating through his suit and why a strange woman was eating Sarah's dinner. Eleanor did not even look at him. She just gently placed her hand over his on the crisp white tablecloth and gave his knuckles a firm, silent squeeze. It was the universal signal they had developed over 50 years of marriage. It meant, do not say a word, just watch. Richard obediently closed his mouth and picked up his water glass. He was a good man, a retired civil engineer who understood blueprints and bridge load capacities perfectly, but social dynamics often went right over his head. Eleanor, however, was sharp as a tack. She did not miss a single detail. She sat perfectly still in her chair, slowly swirling the ice cubes in her tall glass of sweet tea. Her face was completely relaxed, a practiced mask of polite indifference. But behind her eyes, her mind was running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. She looked past the centerpiece of white roses and stared right at Tiffany. She took in the expensive salon blowout, the glossy lips, and the way the girl lazily twirled a heavy silver fork between her perfectly manicured fingers. She looked down and noticed the unmistakable flash of bright red on the soles of Tiffany's high heels. Those were designer shoes, the kind of shoes that cost well over $1,000 a pair. Eleanor took a slow sip of her cold tea. Her blood was beginning to simmer, a slow, rolling boil of maternal rage that had absolutely nothing to do with her son, and everything to do with the woman sitting quietly in the corner chair. As Tiffany continued to rattle on about synergy and corporate strategy, Eleanor let the annoying voice fade into background noise. Her mind drifted back 10 years, completely leaving the luxurious garlic-scented air of the private dining room. 10 years ago, there were no designer shoes. There were no private rooms at Morton's Steakhouse. 10 years ago, Mark and Sarah lived in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. The heating barely worked, and the plumbing made a horrible groaning noise every time you turned on the shower. Mark had just quit his steady corporate job because he was convinced he was going to be the next big tech entrepreneur. He had this pipe dream of a startup, a software company that was going to change the world. Mark had always been a dreamer, always looking for the fast track to success. But dreams do not pay the electric bill. Eleanor remembered visiting their apartment one freezing Tuesday evening in November. Mark was out, blowing through their rapidly dwindling savings account by buying expensive lunches for potential clients who never ended up signing contracts. Sarah was home. She was sitting at a wobbly second-hand kitchen table, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, because they could not afford to turn the thermostat past 60 degrees. Sarah was exhausted. She had just finished working a double shift at a busy diner right off the interstate. Eleanor could still vividly remember the way Sarah looked that night. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, smelling faintly of stale French fries and burnt coffee. She was wearing thick white nursing shoes because her feet were so swollen from standing for 14 hours straight that she could not fit into normal sneakers. But Sarah was not crying. She was not complaining. She was sitting at that cheap table with a shoebox full of cash tips, aggressively sorting the wrinkled $1 and $5 bills into neat little stacks. Eleanor remembered sitting down across from her daughter-in-law, feeling a deep ache of worry in her chest. She had asked Sarah if she wanted some help, if they needed a loan to cover the rent. Sarah had just looked up, offered a tired but determined smile, and shook her head. "We are going to be okay, Mom," Sarah had said, sliding a stack of bills into a bank envelope. "Mark needs time to get this business off the ground. He has a brilliant mind, but he has no idea how to manage a budget. So, I am handling the safety net." That was the night Eleanor learned exactly what Sarah was made of. Sarah was not just paying the rent and keeping the lights on. She was looking 10, 20, 30 years down the road. She knew that retirement and financial peace of mind did not happen by accident, and they certainly did not happen by throwing money at flashy startup ideas. Sarah had marched down to the local bank branch the very next morning. She did not sign up for some complicated, risky investment scheme that promised overnight wealth. She opened a simple, straightforward index fund. It was not glamorous. It was boring, steady, and incredibly smart. Every single week, rain or shine, Sarah took a portion of her diner tips and fed that account. $50 one week, $100 the next. She was literally funding their future with bruised heels and calloused hands. She was putting in the sweat equity. She sacrificed new clothes, vacations, and even a decent cup of coffee, so that one day they would not have to worry about how they were going to survive in their golden years. She built a fortress around their finances, dollar by dollar, while Mark played pretend businessman on her dime. The clinking of a waiter setting down a fresh bread basket snapped Eleanor back to the present moment. She blinked, focusing her eyes back on the scene in front of her. The contrast was so stark, it made her physically nauseous. Here was Tiffany, wearing a dress that cost more than Sarah used to make in a month, sitting in Sarah's chair, eating a meal that Mark was probably paying for with a company credit card. Tiffany was talking a big game about the financial grind and building wealth. She threw around buzzwords like she was a Wall Street prodigy, completely oblivious to the fact that true wealth, the kind of wealth that actually lasts, is built on sacrifice and discipline, not on stealing someone else's husband and draining his accounts. Tiffany had never stood on her feet for 14 hours to make rent. Tiffany had never eaten plain toast for dinner so her partner could pursue a dream. Tiffany was a parasite. She had waited for the house to be fully built, fully furnished, and paid off, and then she had just waltzed through the front door and made herself at home. Eleanor looked over at Sarah in the corner. Sarah was staring blankly at her water glass, her posture rigid. She looked so small, so pushed aside in the very life she had constructed with her own 2 hands. The sheer injustice of it burned in Eleanor's chest. Mark had forgotten. He had let the money and the success go to his head, and he had completely forgotten who held the ladder while he climbed to the top. But Eleanor remembered. Eleanor remembered the smell of that cheap diner coffee. She remembered the index fund. She remembered the shoebox full of wrinkled $5 bills. She took one last long sip of her iced tea, letting the cold liquid cool the fire in her throat. Her face remained a perfect, pleasant mask. She did not frown. She did not scowl. But as she set the glass down on the thick tablecloth, she made a quiet, unbreakable vow. This little girl playing corporate dress-up thought she had hit the jackpot. She thought she was going to reap the rewards of Sarah's decade of sweat and tears. Not on my watch, Eleanor thought, her eyes locking onto Tiffany's bright red lips. The main course was about to arrive, but Eleanor knew that the real feast was going to be serving this arrogant child a massive, bitter plate of reality, and Eleanor was going to make absolutely sure she choked on every single bite. The heavy oak doors swung open once again. The waiters returned, breaking the thick tension in the room. They carried massive ceramic plates that were literally sizzling. The smell of prime rib, seared bone and ribeyes, and truffle mashed potatoes filled the air. Under normal circumstances, this would be a feast. 10 years of marriage is a big deal. It is a milestone that deserves a serious celebration. But right now, the expensive cuts of meat looked like absolute cardboard to almost everyone at the table. Mark was staring at his filet mignon like it might bite him. He took another long gulp of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. He had not eaten a single bite of his appetizer, and it was clear his stomach was tied in a million knots. Richard was just picking at his baked potato, looking back and forth between his son and the stranger sitting at the head of the table. Eleanor sat perfectly straight, holding her knife and fork with absolute precision. She cut a small piece of her steak, chewed it slowly, and kept her eyes locked entirely on the target. And then there was Tiffany. She was the only person in the room who actually had an appetite. She dug into her heavy dinner with zero hesitation, completely unbothered by the radioactive energy humming through the private dining room. She was practically glowing with smug satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought she had established herself as the most important woman in Mark's life. Tiffany finished chewing a bite of steak and set her fork down. She let out a soft, satisfied sigh. Then, she reached across the wide mahogany table toward the silver breadbasket. It was not a casual movement. It was slow and completely deliberate. As she stretched her arm out, she subtly flicked her wrist, causing the cuff of her silk blouse to slide back. The dim, romantic lighting of the steakhouse suddenly caught something bright. It was a flash of pure, blinding white light. There, wrapped securely around Tiffany's wrist, was a thick diamond tennis bracelet. It was not a delicate little piece of jewelry. It was heavy. It was the kind of piece that required serious insurance and a very healthy bank account. The diamonds glittered aggressively, throwing little prisms of light across the white tablecloth. Tiffany stopped with her hand hovering right over the breadbasket. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at Sarah, who was still sitting quietly in the corner chair. Tiffany smiled, a wide, predatory grin that showed all her teeth. "Oh my gosh, do you like it?" Tiffany asked, her voice dripping with fake innocence. She pulled her arm back and held her wrist up, tilting it so the diamonds caught even more light. "I saw you looking at it. Is it not just absolutely stunning?" Sarah did not say a word. She just stared at the bracelet, her face perfectly pale. "Mark gave it to me as a bonus," Tiffany gushed, leaning closer to Mark and practically batting her eyelashes. "We finally landed the Miller account last week after months of grinding. It was a massive commission for the firm. Mark is just such a generous boss. He told me he wanted to show his appreciation for all my late nights at the office." Mark made a pathetic, choking sound in the back of his throat. He dropped his fork, and it clattered loudly against his ceramic plate. He grabbed his water glass with both hands, his knuckles turning white, completely unable to look his wife in the eye. Sarah felt all the air leave the room. It was not just a figure of speech. She literally felt like she had been punched in the chest. Her lungs tightened, and her ears started to ring. She knew those diamonds. She knew the exact cut, the exact setting, and the exact weight. Because she had held that very same bracelet in her own 2 hands just 3 days ago. It was Tuesday morning. Mark had rushed out the door early for a supposedly urgent meeting. Sarah was doing the household chores, a routine she had maintained for 10 solid years. She was putting away a basket of clean laundry in their master bedroom. When she opened Mark's top dresser drawer to put away his socks, she saw something tucked way in the back, hidden under a pile of dark wool. It was a jewelry box, but it was not just any box. It was a distinctive, heavy navy blue velvet box from a very exclusive high-end jeweler downtown. The kind of jeweler you have to make an appointment just to walk inside. Sarah had opened it, her heart fluttering with genuine excitement. When she saw the diamond tennis bracelet sitting on the white satin cushion, tears had actually pricked her eyes. 10 years. 10 years of strict budgets, of packing lunches, of supporting him through every failure and every late night. She thought he had finally realized it. She thought he had bought her the ultimate 10th anniversary gift to say thank you for building their life together. She had carefully closed the box, put it exactly where she found it, and spent the last 3 days feeling a warm, glowing sense of love and security. Now, sitting in the corner of this freezing dining room, Sarah looked down. Tiffany's expensive leather handbag was sitting open on the floor next to her chair. Poking right out of the side pocket, plain as day, was that exact same distinctive navy blue velvet box. The betrayal was a physical blow. It hit her so hard, she had to grip the edges of her wooden chair just to keep from falling over. It was not an anniversary gift. It was never for her. Her husband had taken the money from the company they built together. He had gone to the most expensive jeweler in Chicago, and he had bought a diamond bracelet for a 20-something grifter right before their 10th wedding anniversary. For older Americans, financial infidelity is often a wound that cuts deeper than physical cheating. It is not just about a bruised ego. It is about the destruction of a safety net. It is the terrifying realization that the resources you spent decades accumulating, the money meant for your retirement, your health care, and your peace of mind, is being recklessly squandered by the person you trusted most. Sarah felt a hot, burning tear slide down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She just sat there in the shadows, staring at the empty blue velvet box in the designer purse. All those years of clipping coupons. All those double shifts at the diner. All those nights sitting at the kitchen table, aggressively managing their retirement fund so they would be safe when they got older. She had sacrificed her own youth to make sure Mark had a foundation to stand on. She had put off buying new clothes, skipped vacations, and driven a beat-up sedan for 8 years just to ensure their financial portfolio was rock solid. And this was her return on investment. A spare chair in the corner of a restaurant, watching another woman wear the diamonds that were paid for with her sweat and blood. Mark was not just cheating on her. He was actively stealing from their future. He was taking the security she had painstakingly built and hanging it on the wrist of a flashy junior consultant. Eleanor saw the tear fall. She saw Sarah staring at the purse. She saw the exact moment the younger woman's heart shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Eleanor knew exactly what was going through Sarah's mind. She knew the terror of realizing your financial partner is completely untrustworthy. Eleanor and Richard had spent their entire lives making smart, conservative choices so they could enjoy their golden years without panic. They had tried to teach Mark those same values. But looking at him now, sweating and cowering into his expensive suit, Eleanor realized her son had learned absolutely nothing. The simmering anger inside Eleanor completely solidified into cold, hard steel. She slowly placed her knife and fork down on the table. She wiped her mouth with her linen napkin and folded it neatly next to her plate. The time for polite observation was over. Mark had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had publicly humiliated his wife, and worse, he was endangering the financial stability of their entire family. It was time for his mother to step in. It was time to burn his little house of cards completely to the ground. The tension in the private dining room was so thick, you could practically cut it with one of the heavy silver steak knives. Mark had completely checked out, staring down at his plate like he was hoping a hole would magically open up in the floor and swallow him whole. His silence was the worst kind of betrayal. But to Tiffany, it was a green light. She took his absolute lack of a spine as a sign of submission. She felt completely emboldened, practically glowing with the arrogant confidence of someone who thinks they are the smartest person in the room. She took a long, slow sip of her expensive red wine, letting the diamond tennis bracelet catch the light of the chandelier one more time. Then she leaned back in her chair and decided it was time to educate the table. You know, the real issue today is that people just do not understand modern wealth management, Tiffany announced to the room, completely unprompted. She waved her hand dismissively, the heavy diamonds flashing. I see it all the time with our clients, especially the older folks. No offense, Richard and Eleanor, but your generation just does not get it. You all grew up thinking you could just put your money in a boring savings account or a basic mutual fund, get a gold watch at 65, and ride off into the sunset. Richard stopped chewing his baked potato. He slowly lowered his fork, looking at Tiffany like she had just sprouted a second head. Eleanor did not move a single muscle. She just kept her eyes locked on the flashy young woman, letting her dig her own grave. Tiffany took another sip of wine, completely blind to the silent fury building across the table. It just does not work like that anymore, she continued, using her free hand to make sweeping, dramatic gestures. You cannot be terrified of risk. Inflation will absolutely eat you alive if you just sit on your cash. I was looking over Mark's portfolio a few weeks ago, and honestly, it was a total disaster. Way too conservative. It was like whoever set it up had no idea how to actually build generational wealth. In the corner of the room, Sarah closed her eyes for a brief second. Her chest rose and fell with a sharp, ragged breath. Whoever set it up, that was her. She was the one who had spent a decade carefully balancing that portfolio, prioritizing slow, steady growth and security over reckless gambling. So, I told Mark we had to do a complete overhaul, Tiffany bragged, reaching over to give Mark's shoulder a patronizing squeeze. I am helping him restructure his entire financial profile. We are talking aggressive asset allocation. Moving capital into high-yield, fast-growth sectors. You have to pivot if you want to retire early and actually enjoy your money, right? We are making sure his golden years are actually golden. The sheer, unbelievable irony of the situation was almost suffocating. The audience in that room knew exactly what was happening, even if Tiffany was completely clueless. She was sitting there in a designer dress, wearing a diamond bracelet paid for by someone else, trying to sound like a Wall Street heavy hitter. And she was giving this unsolicited, condescending financial lecture directly to Eleanor and Richard. She was lecturing the two people who were quiet, self-made millionaires. The two people who had actually bankrolled Mark's entire business operation when the banks laughed him out of the lobby. Eleanor and Richard had built real, lasting wealth through decades of hard work, discipline, and the exact kind of conservative investing that Tiffany was currently mocking. They were the literal safety net for the entire family, and this 20-something grifter was trying to teach them about compound interest. Eleanor felt a cold, hard knot of determination settle into her stomach. She looked at her son, who was currently sweating through his tailored shirt. Mark knew where the seed money came from. He knew his mother had full legal access to the company ledgers as the primary guarantor of his business loans. Yet he sat there, paralyzed by his own mess, letting his mistress insult his parents and his wife in the same breath. But before Eleanor could drop the hammer, someone else finally reached their absolute limit. Sarah pushed her wooden chair back from the corner of the table. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that instantly cut off Tiffany's rambling lecture. Everyone turned to look at Sarah. She was no longer crying. The shock and the heartbreak had completely burned away, leaving nothing but cold, terrifying clarity. She looked at the blue velvet jeweler box sticking out of Tiffany's purse, and then she looked directly at the man she had been married to for 10 years. Her voice was shaking, but it was incredibly firm, carrying the weight of a decade of broken promises. "Mark," Sarah said, her tone slicing through the room like a razor blade. "I have one question for you, and you are going to look me in the eye when you answer it." Mark flinched. He slowly raised his head, his face a miserable, blotchy shade of beet red. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That bracelet," Sarah said, pointing a trembling finger at Tiffany's wrist. "The one you gave her as a bonus for all her hard work. Did you buy that with company funds, or did you buy it out of our joint savings account?" The question hung in the air, heavy and lethal. It was the ultimate test. If he used company funds, he was committing financial fraud against his own business, and by extension, his mother, who backed the loans. If he used the joint account, he was directly stealing from the safety net Sarah had built for their children. Either way, he was backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. Mark looked completely terrified. He opened his mouth again, stuttering, making a pathetic stammering noise. Sarah, please, you have to understand. I can explain everything. It is not what it looks like." "It is a simple question, Mark," Sarah pushed, her voice rising in volume, demanding the respect she was owed. "Which account did the money come from?" The silence that followed was agonizing. Mark was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between his furious wife, his silent, terrifying mother, and the woman sitting next to him. But instead of answering, instead of finally acting like a man and taking responsibility for the destruction he had caused, he was saved by the most arrogant voice in the room. Tiffany let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She rolled her eyes so hard it looked like it actually hurt. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive white tablecloth, and looked at Sarah with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Honestly, Sarah," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you are making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. It is a business write-off. Mark ran it through the corporate expense account as a performance incentive. It is standard practice in the corporate world, but I would not expect you to understand the nuances of tax law." Tiffany offered a sickly sweet, patronizing smile, delivering the final fatal blow of disrespect. "Do not stress your pretty little head over the taxes, honey. We have the finances totally under control." Sarah stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of the insult. To be told not to worry her pretty little head about the finances she had personally managed, protected, and grown from absolutely nothing. The finances that this girl was currently bleeding dry. Eleanor watched Sarah take a deep, shaky breath, absorbing the full weight of the humiliation. And in that exact second, Eleanor knew the time for waiting was over. The trap was fully set, the disrespect was documented, and Mark had completely failed his final test. Eleanor reached down to the floor, her fingers brushing the heavy leather straps of her oversized tote bag. It was time to show this arrogant little consultant exactly what a real financial grind looked like. The sheer audacity of the insult hung in the warm air of the private dining room. "Do not stress your pretty little head over the taxes." The words echoed off the dark mahogany walls, settling over the table like a toxic fog. Sarah sat perfectly still in her corner, absorbing the unbelievable disrespect. Mark remained completely silent, staring a hole through the expensive white tablecloth, practically melting into his tailored suit. Tiffany leaned back in her chair, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face, completely convinced she had just won the ultimate power struggle. She had no idea she had just signed her own death warrant. Eleanor took a slow, deep breath. The time for polite observation and silent judgment was officially over. She reached out with a steady hand and picked up her heavy silver butter knife. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell or cause a scene. Instead, she gently tapped the edge of the silver blade against her crystal water glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sharp, clear sound cut through the suffocating tension in the room like a gunshot. It was not a loud noise, but it carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of a woman who was entirely in charge. The waiters, who had been hovering near the oak doors waiting to clear the plates, immediately froze and stepped back out into the hallway, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Richard sat up perfectly straight, his military posture returning in a split second. He folded his hands in his lap, knowing his wife was about to take control of the situation. The table went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent in the ceiling. Eleanor placed the butter knife back down on the crisp linen tablecloth, aligning it perfectly parallel to her plate. She folded her hands, rested them on the edge of the table, and turned her head to look directly at the flashy young woman sitting in her daughter-in-law's chair. "Take off the bracelet," Eleanor said. Her voice was not angry. It was not loud. It was incredibly calm, cold, and completely flat. It was the exact tone a judge uses right before handing down a life sentence. Tiffany blinked, the smug smile freezing on her glossy lips. She looked at Eleanor, then looked at Mark, trying to gauge the situation. She let out a short, nervous laugh, assuming this had to be some kind of dark joke. "Excuse me?" Tiffany asked, her voice losing a bit of its arrogant edge. "I did not stutter, young lady," Eleanor replied, her eyes locking onto Tiffany like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "I said, take off the diamond bracelet, unclasp it, and place it directly in the center of this table. Right now," Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She reached her hand over, instinctively covering the heavy diamonds on her wrist. She looked at Mark for backup, expecting him to jump in and defend her. "Mark, honey, what is your mother talking about?" Mark opened his mouth, but Eleanor did not even give him a chance to speak. "Do not look at him!" Eleanor snapped, the sudden sharpness in her voice making both Mark and Tiffany physically flinch. "He has absolutely no power here. He cannot help you. He cannot save you. He cannot even save himself at this point. Look at me." Tiffany swallowed hard, her eyes darting back to the 72-year-old matriarch sitting quietly across the table. "You sat there and gave us quite the little lecture on wealth management," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping into a deadly, conversational rhythm. "You talked about asset allocation. You talked about the financial grind. You seem to think you know exactly how the business world operates. So, let us talk about business. Let us talk about how things actually work in the real world, outside of your ridiculous little corporate buzzwords." Eleanor leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, dominating the entire room without even raising her voice. "You think Mark is the boss?" Eleanor said, gesturing vaguely toward her sweating son. "You think he is the big-shot executive who gets to write off diamond bracelets on a company expense account to impress his little girlfriends? But you missed one massive, glaring detail when you were looking over his portfolio." Tiffany was completely silent now. The color was rapidly draining from her face as she realized the old woman sitting across from her was not some clueless grandmother. 10 years ago, Eleanor explained, keeping her words simple and brutally direct. "My son wanted to start a business. He had a lot of big ideas, but he had absolutely zero capital. The commercial banks laughed him right out of their lobbies. They would not give him a dime because he had no collateral and no proven track record. The only way he got that business off the ground was because his wife, the woman sitting in the corner that you just insulted, worked her fingers to the bone to pay their rent. And the only way he got the corporate funding to actually open his doors was because I stepped in." Eleanor paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. "I am the primary guarantor on every single commercial line of credit that company holds," Eleanor stated, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "Every SBA loan, every corporate credit card, every single piece of operational capital that flows through that office is legally backed by my personal assets and my retirement portfolio." Tiffany looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She stared at Eleanor, her mouth slightly open, the heavy diamond bracelet suddenly feeling like a pair of handcuffs on her wrist. "Do you know what it means to be the primary guarantor on a commercial account in the United States?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head slightly. "It means the bank does not report to Mark. The bank reports to me. I do not just get a nice little summary at the end of the year. I do not just read the sanitized quarterly reports that Mark hands out at board meetings. I have full, unrestricted legal access to the back-end financial audits. I see every single dollar that comes in, and I see every single dollar that goes out." Mark buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan. He knew it was over. The house of cards had officially collapsed. Eleanor turned her gaze back to Tiffany, who was now trembling slightly in her stolen chair. "You thought you were so clever," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with pure disgust. "You thought you could siphon off a little bit of the cream without anyone noticing? I saw the first payment 3 months ago. A mysterious consulting fee routed to a brand new limited liability company. Then, a few weeks later, a massive performance bonus paid out to the exact same routing number. Do you honestly think I got to my age and built the wealth I have by letting money just disappear into thin air?" Tiffany shook her head, tears of genuine panic starting to well up in her eyes. "I did not. It was for my consulting work." "Stop lying," Eleanor commanded, cutting her off instantly. You are not a consultant. You are a parasite. You target men who are going through a midlife crisis. Men who are stupid enough to think with their egos instead of their brains. You found my son, you saw the fancy suits and the expensive dinners, and you thought you had found a golden goose. You thought you could just drain his accounts, secure your own little nest egg, and walk away before the IRS or the family ever caught on. Eleanor pointed a steady, manicured finger directly at the blue velvet jeweler box sticking out of Tiffany's designer purse on the floor. I know exactly how much that bracelet cost, Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave, filled with the kind of fierce, protective rage that only a mother can muster. Because I watched the funds get illegally transferred out of the corporate holding account 4 days ago. You are wearing stolen property. You are wearing the sweat equity that Sarah built. You are wearing the retirement security of my grandchildren. And I will see you rot in a federal prison before I let you walk out of this restaurant with it. The silence in the room was absolute. The background noise of the steakhouse outside the heavy oak doors seemed to completely fade away. Eleanor had stripped away all the lies, all the corporate jargon, and all the pathetic excuses. She had laid the brutal financial reality out on the table for everyone to see. There was no synergy. There was no aggressive asset allocation. There was just a weak, cowardly man stealing from his own family, and a greedy young woman who thought she was untouchable. Now, Eleanor said, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. I am going to tell you exactly what is going to happen next. You are going to take off that bracelet. You are going to leave it on this table. And then you are going to pack up your ridiculous oversized purse, and you are going to walk out of those doors, and you are never going to speak to my son, my daughter-in-law, or my grandchildren ever again. If you try to keep the jewelry, or if you try to fight me on this, I will have my corporate attorneys freeze every single asset associated with your fraudulent LLC by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will drag you through civil litigation until you are completely bankrupt, and then I will hand the back-end audit files directly to the district attorney for corporate fraud. Tiffany was openly crying now, her fake tough girl persona completely shattered into a million pieces. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached across her wrist. Take it off, Eleanor repeated, the command echoing like thunder in the small room. With trembling fingers, Tiffany fumbled with the intricate platinum clasp of the tennis bracelet. It took her 3 tries to get it undone. The heavy diamonds slid off her wrist and pooled onto the white tablecloth with a soft, expensive clatter. She slowly pushed the sparkling pile of jewels toward the center of the table, exactly where Eleanor had pointed. Eleanor looked at the diamonds, then looked back up at the terrified young woman. She did not offer an ounce of sympathy. She did not feel a single drop of pity. She had spent her entire adult life protecting her family and making sure they had a solid, secure foundation to stand on. She was not about to let a flashy grifter tear it all down. We are done here, Eleanor said, dismissing the girl entirely. Get out of my sight. Tiffany did not say another word. She grabbed her designer handbag from the floor, practically knocking her chair backward as she scrambled to her feet. She did not look at Mark. She did not look at Sarah. She turned and practically ran for the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the hallway and leaving nothing behind but the sickeningly sweet smell of her floral perfume and a pile of diamonds on the table. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath, letting the adrenaline slowly settle in her chest. The trash had officially been taken out. But the night was not over yet. She turned her head slowly, her cold, furious gaze locking onto her son, who was still hiding his face in his hands. It was time to deal with the real problem. Tiffany stopped halfway to the heavy oak doors. She had left the diamond bracelet on the table just like Eleanor demanded, but her pride simply would not let her walk away in complete silence. She turned back around with her designer bag clutched tightly to her chest. Her face was flushed with anger and a deep, stinging embarrassment. She looked at Eleanor and tried to muster one last pathetic defense to save face. "You are crazy!" Tiffany spat out, her voice shaking with fake indignation. "You are just a paranoid old woman. I am a legitimate business consultant. I have a degree. I have clients all over the Midwest. You cannot just sit there and accuse me of being some kind of criminal just because your son decided he wanted a younger woman on his team. Mark knows the value I bring to his company. You are going completely off the deep end, and when he realizes it, you are going to look incredibly foolish." Mark kept his head buried in his hands, completely unable to back her up. He was a sinking ship, and Tiffany was desperately trying to bail out the water. Eleanor did not even blink. She did not raise her voice or show a single ounce of anger. She simply reached down into the deep leather tote bag resting by her feet. She had come to this anniversary dinner fully prepared for a war, and she always kept her best ammunition for the final strike. "I told you we were going to talk about the real world," Eleanor said calmly. She pulled a thick manila envelope from her bag. It was the heavy kind of envelope secured with a little string tie. She undid the string with slow, deliberate movements. Everyone at the table watched her in dead silence. Even Sarah leaned forward in her corner chair, completely captivated by whatever her mother-in-law was about to produce. Eleanor reached into the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. With a swift flick of her wrist, she tossed the entire stack across the table. They landed perfectly on top of Tiffany's abandoned plate, scattering across the medium rare filet mignon and the truffle mashed potatoes. "Take a good look at your legitimate consulting business," Eleanor instructed, her tone dripping with absolute ice. Tiffany froze. Her eyes darted down to the glossy photos resting on her dinner plate. All the fake outrage and the arrogant confidence drained out of her body in a single, terrifying second. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Eleanor did not just rely on reading the back-end financial audits. Older folks know that numbers on a spreadsheet can be easily manipulated. They know that a smart scammer can hide behind a fake limited liability company and a bunch of corporate buzzwords. But you cannot hide from a licensed private investigator with a really good camera lens. When Eleanor first noticed the strange payments coming out of the corporate accounts, she did not ask Mark about them. She knew he would just lie to cover his tracks and move the money somewhere else. Instead, she called a retired police detective from her church congregation, who now ran a private security firm in the city. She paid him a very handsome retainer to follow the money and to follow the girl. Those photos on the table were the result of 3 weeks of intensive surveillance. They were not pictures of Tiffany working hard in a corporate office. They were high-definition photos taken down in Boca Raton, Florida. The bright Florida sun was unmistakable. In the first photo, Tiffany was standing on the deck of a massive luxury yacht, wearing a tiny designer swimsuit and holding a glass of expensive champagne. But she was not alone. She had her arm wrapped tightly around a man who looked to be pushing 70 years old. He was deeply tanned, wearing expensive linen resort wear, and looking extremely wealthy. In the next photo, they were sitting together at a high-end country club. The man was kissing Tiffany's cheek while she laughed, tossing her head back in pure joy. And in the third photo, which was zoomed in with absolute precision, the camera captured Tiffany's left hand resting on a mahogany dinner table. Right there on her ring finger was a diamond engagement ring the size of a small boulder. "You really need to be more careful about your travel schedule," Eleanor noted, taking a sip of her iced tea. Flying down to Florida every other weekend on my son's corporate expense account leaves a very clear paper trail. And getting engaged to a retired real estate developer while you are simultaneously draining a software company in Chicago is just terrible time management. The private investigator did not just take pictures. He pulled the public records on her fake limited liability company. Eleanor explained to the silent room that the so-called consulting firm was registered to a vacant strip mall in Miami. There were no other employees. There was no corporate website. There was absolutely nothing but a bank routing number designed to catch the money she was siphoning out of Mark's accounts. Mark finally lifted his head from his hands. He looked at the photos scattered across the dinner plate. His eyes widened in absolute horror. He stared at the picture of the older man and the massive engagement ring. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. For the past 3 months, he truly believed he was living the dream. He thought he was a high-powered executive who commanded respect and admiration. He thought he had outgrown his quiet, hard-working wife and naturally attracted a beautiful younger woman. Now, he saw the absolute truth. He was not special. He was a mark. He was a walking, automated teller machine. He was just a temporary source of cash to fund her real life down in the Sunshine State. Tiffany probably laughed at him every time she boarded her first-class flight back to Florida. The sheer humiliation made him physically sick. He grabbed his water glass with trembling hands, completely unable to speak. Eleanor looked directly at Tiffany, who was now physically trembling. "I know exactly who you are," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence. "My investigator pulled your entire background. You do not have a business degree. You have a very long, very documented history of targeting newly successful businessmen in the Midwest. Men who just got their first taste of real money and have absolutely no idea how to handle it. Men who are stupid enough to think with their egos." Eleanor leaned forward, making sure every single word landed with maximum impact. "Your method of operation is completely predictable. You find a guy like Mark who is insecure and desperate to feel important. You shower him with attention. You use his own business to funnel corporate perks, bonuses, and luxury gifts directly into your own pockets. You convince him to buy you expensive things under the guise of performance incentives. And then right before the Internal Revenue Service flags the accounts for audit, or right before the wife finally catches on, you completely disappear. You pack up your designer bags and you fly back to Florida to live the good life on someone else's dime." The brutal honesty of the situation resonated deeply in the room. This is the exact nightmare that older Americans fear most when they think about their financial security. The world is full of seasoned grifters who prey on the vulnerable and the naive. They do not use a gun to rob you. They use flattery, fake synergy, and a pretty smile. They drain your retirement accounts, they destroy your safety net, and they leave your family in absolute financial ruin. Sarah sat in the corner, listening to the entire scheme unfold. She felt a wave of profound sickness wash over her. All those years she spent working double shifts at the diner. All those years she carefully managed their index funds and balanced the household budget. She had built a fortress around their family to protect them from the harsh realities of the world. And her husband had just opened the front door and invited a parasite inside to steal everything she had built. The older generation knows this pain all too well. You spend your entire life making sacrifices. You skip the fancy dinners and the expensive vacations because you want to make sure your family is secure when the hard times come. You build a solid foundation brick by brick, and it takes incredible discipline, but it only takes one moment of pure selfish greed to bring the entire house crashing down. Sarah realized tonight that Mark never respected the sweat equity. He never understood the value of $1 because he was not the one who stood on his feet for 14 hours a day to earn it. He had risked their entire future for a woman who was literally laughing at him behind his back. Tiffany stood there completely exposed. Her entire scam was laid bare on the table for everyone to see. There was no more denying it. There were no more corporate buzzwords she could use to sound legitimate. She was a fraud, and Eleanor had completely destroyed her. "You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else in this room," Eleanor said, shaking her head in disgust. "You thought you could come into my city, target my family, and steal the money that my daughter-in-law worked her entire youth to build. You thought we were just a bunch of clueless older folks who did not understand modern wealth management." Eleanor pointed a firm, steady finger right at the heavy oak doors. "But you picked the wrong family, and you picked the wrong mother-in-law. I told you once, and I will not tell you again. Get out of my sight before I call my lawyer and have you arrested for corporate embezzlement." When Tiffany finally grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door, she looked back one last time. She did not look sorry. She just looked angry that she had been caught. The mask had completely slipped, revealing the cold, calculating predator underneath. She did not care about the marriage she had destroyed. She did not care about the financial chaos she was leaving in her wake. All she cared about was getting away before the consequences caught up with her. She pushed through the door and vanished into the bustling restaurant, leaving her stolen diamonds and her shattered lies behind on the mahogany table. The grifter was gone. The fake consulting fees were over. The truth was completely out in the open. Eleanor sat back in her chair and smoothed out her linen napkin. She had neutralized the immediate threat to their financial security. She had protected the assets and she had exposed the scam. But as she looked across the table at her son, she knew the hardest part of the night was just beginning. The parasite had been removed, but the massive gaping wound left behind by Mark's unbelievable stupidity was still bleeding all over the table. The heavy oak door swung completely shut, cutting off the background noise of the steakhouse. The silence that filled the private dining room was heavy and suffocating. The only evidence that Tiffany had ever been there was the lingering smell of her cheap floral perfume and the pile of heavy diamonds sparkling under the chandelier, right next to the scattered photographs of her Florida fiancé. Mark sat frozen in his chair. He stared down at the pictures ruining his expensive steak dinner. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. The absolute magnitude of what he had just done was finally crashing down on him. For months, he had been living in a pathetic fantasy world. He thought he was a powerful executive, a man who deserved the admiration of a beautiful younger woman. He thought he was outsmarting everyone, but looking at the undeniable proof on the table, the reality hit him like a freight train. He was not a mastermind. He was a fool. He was just another naive, insecure man going through a midlife crisis, easily manipulated by a professional con artist who saw him coming from a mile away. She had played him for a total idiot, draining his business accounts to fund her real life with a millionaire down in Boca Raton. Mark slowly looked up from the table. He looked at his father, Richard, who was staring at him with a mixture of profound pity and deep disgust. Then he looked at his wife. Sarah was still sitting in the spare wooden chair in the corner. She did not look angry anymore. The tears had completely stopped. She just looked incredibly tired. She looked like a woman who had just watched a decade of her life burn to the ground for absolutely nothing. Mark felt a wave of pure panic rise in his chest. He realized he was entirely alone. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his heavy chair backward. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud, but he did not even notice. Sarah, please, Mark stammered. His voice was cracking, completely stripped of any arrogance or pride. You have to listen to me. I was completely out of my mind. The stress of the business, the long hours, it all just got to me. She threw herself at me, and I made a stupid, terrible mistake. It meant absolutely nothing. I love you. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. I will do whatever it takes. Sarah did not move a single muscle. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had starved for and worked double shifts for, and she felt absolutely nothing but cold emptiness. Do not insult my intelligence, Mark, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying across the room with devastating clarity. You did not make a mistake. You made a series of calculated choices every single day for months. You lied to my face. You stole from our future. And you brought that woman into a room with your parents to humiliate me on our 10th anniversary. We are completely done. Mark let out a pathetic sob. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes toward the head of the table. Mom, please, you have to help me talk to her. I messed up. I know I messed up, but I am still your son. Eleanor sat perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly on the crisp white tablecloth. She looked at her son, and her heart ached with the kind of deep, heavy sorrow that only a mother can understand. She loved Mark. She would always love him. But she also knew that protecting him from the consequences of his own actions would be the worst thing she could possibly do. In the real world, actions have permanent consequences. And when you gamble with the financial security of your family, you have to pay the ultimate price. Sit down, Mark, Eleanor commanded. Her voice was not angry, but it was incredibly firm, leaving absolutely no room for debate. We are not discussing your marriage right now. Sarah has made her decision, and I fully support her. What we are going to discuss is the reality of your financial situation moving forward. Mark slowly picked up his chair and sank back into it. He looked completely defeated, completely broken. You have always been very proud of your early retirement plan, Eleanor began, keeping her tone strictly business. You love to tell your friends at the country club how you are going to sell the business and live off the family trust by the time you are 50. You banked on that money. You assumed it was your safety net no matter what happened. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes wide with fear. The family trust was the crown jewel of Eleanor and Richard's estate planning. It was an irrevocable trust, completely loaded with high-yield assets, real estate, and decades of careful, conservative investments. It was designed to provide generational wealth for Mark, Sarah, and their children. Let me give you a quick lesson in estate planning, Eleanor said, leaning forward slightly. When your father and I drafted that trust, we did not just blindly hand over the keys to the kingdom. We spent our entire lives building that wealth through hard work, discipline, and absolute integrity. We wanted to make sure it was protected from bad investments, bad markets, and most importantly, bad decisions. Eleanor paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a brief, agonizing moment. That irrevocable trust contains a very strict ironclad morality and fiduciary clause, Eleanor explained. It is a standard protective measure for high-net-worth families in the United States. It clearly states that if any beneficiary engages in financial fraud, embezzles funds, or brings severe public scandal and moral disgrace to the family name, the trustees have the immediate right to completely sever their access to the funds. Mark's jaw practically dropped. He stared at his mother in absolute horror. Mom, no, you cannot do that. That is my future. That is my retirement. I am not doing anything, Mark, Eleanor corrected him quickly. You did this to yourself. You used corporate funds to buy diamond bracelets for a con artist. You committed financial fraud against the business, and you brought absolute disgrace to this family. Your father and I activated that clause this morning after the private investigator gave me his final report. You are completely cut off. You will not see a single dime of that trust money for the rest of your natural life. The funds will skip a generation and be held strictly in a protective trust for your children. Mark felt the room start to spin. The massive safety net he had always relied on was just completely ripped away. He was not going to retire early. He was going to have to work for the rest of his life, but he still had his business. He desperately clung to that one final thread of hope. Okay, Mark breathed heavily, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Okay, I understand. I will just have to rebuild the company. I will buy out the shares, scale back on expenses, and I will just work until I am 70. I can build it back up. It is my company. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time all night, a small, sad smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was not a smile of victory. It was a smile of a woman who had outplayed an arrogant opponent 5 moves ago. Your company? Eleanor asked, tilting her head. She reached back into her large leather tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the table, right over the scattered photographs of Tiffany and her Florida millionaire. Mark, when you started this business 10 years ago, you had absolutely terrible credit, Eleanor reminded him. You had defaulted on 3 credit cards, and you owed the government back taxes. No bank would touch you. So, when I provided the seed money and co-signed the commercial loans to get you off the ground, my legal team drafted the paperwork to protect the family assets. Mark stared at the paper. It was a copy of the original promissory note and the corporate operating agreement. That seed money was never a gift, Eleanor stated, delivering the final fatal blow. It was a legally binding commercial loan. And because your financial history was a complete disaster, the loan was not drafted in your name. Mark read the top line of the contract. His breath hitched in his throat. The loan, the primary guarantor status, and 51% of the controlling equity shares were drafted in Sarah's name, Eleanor revealed smoothly. She is the majority shareholder of the business. She holds the debt. You are technically just an employee, Mark. You are a minority partner who just got caught embezzling company funds to pay for his mistress. The checkmate was absolutely perfect. It was a masterclass in financial protection. Eleanor had seen the risks 10 years ago, and she had quietly built a legal fortress around the woman who actually did the hard work. Sarah had put in the sweat equity, and Eleanor had made absolutely sure that Sarah legally owned the house she was building. Mark had just tanked his marriage, lost his entire business, and completely destroyed his early retirement in one fell swoop. He had traded a loyal wife and millions of dollars in secure family assets for a few months of cheap thrills with a woman who did not even care about him. He dropped the piece of paper. He buried his face in his hands, and right there in the middle of the private dining room at Morton's Steakhouse, the former high-rolling executive completely broke down and wept. Eleanor did not comfort him. Richard did not reach out. They just sat in silence, letting the consequences of a ruined life wash over the room. Real wealth is not about flashy cars, expensive dinners, or diamond bracelets. Real wealth is about loyalty, integrity, and trusting the people standing next to you in the trenches. Mark had forgotten the most important rule of the financial grind, and now he was going to pay the bill for the rest of his life. The silence in the private dining room was absolute. The echo of the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind Tiffany still seemed to vibrate in the air. The reality of her sudden exit hung over the table. The moment she realized she was completely busted, and there was absolutely no more money to bleed from Mark, she had abandoned ship. She had grabbed her overpriced designer bag, unclasped the diamond bracelet, and practically thrown it onto the mahogany table. She had walked out of the restaurant without a single word of defense, leaving Mark entirely alone to face the firing squad. Mark stared at the pile of platinum and diamonds resting next to the private investigator's photos. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The illusion of his power was completely gone. He looked across the table at Sarah. She was still sitting in the uncomfortable wooden spare chair in the corner of the room. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. The tears she had shed earlier were completely dry. "Sarah, please." "Mark," began, his voice cracking in the quiet room. He reached his hands out across the table, palms up, in a desperate, pleading gesture. "You have to talk to me. We have been married for 10 years. We have 2 beautiful children. We have built an entire life together. You cannot just throw all of that away over one stupid mistake." I was stressed out. I was not thinking clearly. She meant absolutely nothing to me. "I will do anything, Sarah. We can go to marriage counseling. I will go to therapy. I will sell the business. We can start over. Please, just say something." Sarah looked at his outstretched hands. She remembered holding those hands when they were standing at the altar. She remembered holding them when they lived in that freezing apartment eating cheap canned soup. But now those hands just looked weak. They looked like the hands of a coward who had gladly traded her security for a cheap thrill. "I am not throwing anything away, Mark," Sarah said, her voice steady and perfectly calm. "You took everything we built and you set it on fire. You did not just cheat on me. You stole from our children. You humiliated me in front of your parents. And you sat there in silence while that girl told me not to worry my pretty little head about the finances I personally built. There is no counseling that can fix that. There is no apology in the world that can undo what you did tonight." Mark let out a choked sob. He pulled his hands back and turned his desperate gaze toward his mother. He looked like a terrified little boy looking for his mom to swoop in and fix his broken toy. "Mom, please!" Mark begged, tears openly streaming down his red face. "You have to make her see reason. You cannot let her take the business. You cannot cut me out of the family trust. I am your son. I am your only son. You raised me better than this. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. Dad, tell her. Tell her we can fix this." Richard, who had been completely silent the entire evening, finally looked at his son. Richard was a man of few words, but he believed deeply in honor and responsibility. He looked at Mark and shook his head slowly. "Do not look at me, son," Richard said, his voice heavy with profound disappointment. "You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it? You disrespected your wife. You tried to defraud your mother. You are entirely on your own." Mark turned back to Eleanor, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Mom, please!" Eleanor did not look at him with a mother's warmth. She did not look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the kind of look that strips a man down to his very bones. She sat perfectly straight in her chair, embodying the absolute authority of a matriarch who was done playing games. "Stop whining," Eleanor commanded, her voice slicing through his pathetic tears like a cold steel blade. "You are a grown man, and you are acting like a spoiled child who just got caught stealing candy. I did raise you better than this, Mark. I raised you to respect women. I raised you to understand the value of $1. And I certainly raised you to honor your vows. You chose to ignore every single lesson your father and I ever taught you. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her forearms on the crisp, white tablecloth. She looked directly into Mark's terrified eyes and delivered the final, absolute ultimatum. You have exactly until midnight tonight to go back to the house and pack a single suitcase. Eleanor stated, her tone completely devoid of any emotion. You will take your clothes and your personal toiletries. You will not touch the joint checkbook. You will not take any valuable electronics. And you will get out of the house that belongs to Sarah. Mark stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Mom, where am I supposed to go? I do not have any cash. My credit cards are tied to the business accounts. That sounds like a personal problem, Eleanor replied smoothly, not giving an inch. Maybe you can go sleep in the lobby of that fake consulting firm down in Miami. Or maybe you can go find a cheap motel on the highway. I frankly do not care. But if you are still in that house at midnight, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing on a property that is legally owned by my daughter-in-law. Eleanor paused, letting the brutal reality of his new life completely sink in. And if you think about trying to take so much as a coffee mug that belongs to her, I will bury you in civil litigation until you are 90 years old. I will freeze every single asset you think you have left. I will hire a team of corporate lawyers to drag you through the courts until you are completely bankrupt. Do you understand me, Mark? Mark swallowed hard, completely defeated. He nodded his head slowly, looking down at his lap. Yes, Mom, I understand. Get out, Eleanor said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. We are celebrating an anniversary tonight, and you are no longer invited. Mark stood up slowly. He looked around the beautiful private dining room, taking in the expensive steaks, the fine wine, and the incredible luxury he had always taken for granted. He looked at his father, who refused to meet his eyes. He looked at his mother, who had completely disowned his terrible behavior. And finally, he looked at Sarah, the woman who had loved him when he was absolutely nothing. She did not look back. Without another word, Mark turned around. He walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors, his shoulders slumped forward, carrying the absolute crushing weight of his own terrible choices. He pushed the doors open and walked out into the busy restaurant, leaving the private room completely silent once again. The parasite was gone. The lying husband was gone. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly light and breathable. The oppressive, suffocating tension had vanished entirely, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, letting the dust settle. She looked at her husband Richard and gave him a gentle, reassuring smile. Then she turned her attention to the corner of the room. Sarah was still sitting in the spare wooden chair. She was staring at the empty space where her husband had just been standing. She had just gone through the most traumatic emotional roller coaster of her entire life. She had lost her marriage, but she had kept her dignity. She had kept her house. She had kept her business. And she had learned that she had an absolute fortress of support standing right behind her. Eleanor slowly pushed her chair back and stood up from the table. She smoothed out her elegant skirt and walked around the large mahogany table toward the corner of the room. Her heavy footsteps were the only sound in the quiet space. She reached Sarah and stood in front of her. The fierce, terrifying corporate matriarch who had just destroyed 2 lives in the span of 30 minutes was completely gone. In her place was a warm, loving mother who was looking at her daughter. Eleanor reached down and extended both of her hands. Sarah looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears of immense gratitude. She reached out and took Eleanor's hands. Eleanor's grip was incredibly strong and deeply comforting. She gently pulled Sarah up out of the uncomfortable spare chair. "You did beautifully tonight," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with immense pride. "You held your head high, and you let the trash take itself out. I am so incredibly proud to call you my daughter." Sarah smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered back. Eleanor wrapped her arms securely around Sarah's shoulders. She gently guided her daughter-in-law away from the corner of the room and walked her right over to the head of the table. She pulled out the large, comfortable chair that Tiffany had vacated earlier. The chair that rightfully belonged to the woman of the hour. "Sit down, sweetheart," Eleanor said warmly, patting the back of the chair. "You belong at the head of this table. You built this family, and you earned this seat." Sarah sat down in the large chair, looking out over the beautiful table, the scattered photos, and the pile of stolen diamonds. She felt a deep, overwhelming sense of relief wash over her entire body. The worst was over. The truth was out, and her future was completely secure. Eleanor walked back to her own seat and sat down next to Richard. She picked up her crystal water glass and held it up in the air, looking directly at Sarah. "Now," Eleanor said, a bright, determined smile spreading across her face. "We have some prime rib getting cold, and the adults have some serious estate planning to update." Richard raised his glass as well, a warm smile breaking through his serious demeanor. To Sarah, he said, his voice strong and supportive. Sarah picked up her own glass and raised it high. For the first time in months, she looked forward to the future. She knew there would be hard days ahead. Divorces are never easy. But she also knew she would never have to worry about the financial grind again. She had put in the sweat equity, and now she was finally going to reap the rewards. She clinked her glass in the quiet room, ready to start the beautiful, secure golden years she truly deserved. 6 months later, the harsh, bitter winds of the Chicago winter had completely faded away, leaving behind the soft, warm breeze of early spring. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Sarah was sitting on Eleanor's sprawling back porch, tucked comfortably into a thick cushioned wicker chair. The sun was shining brightly overhead, casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawn. Sarah took a long, slow sip of her sweet iced tea. The glass was cold and beaded with condensation. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes, just listening to the quiet rustling of the oak trees in the backyard. For the first time in an incredibly long time, her shoulders were completely relaxed. The heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for the past decade was entirely gone. She felt light, she felt safe, and most importantly, she finally felt like she had complete control over her own future. Eleanor walked out onto the porch carrying a plate of freshly baked lemon cookies. She set the plate down on the small glass patio table between them and took a seat in the chair right next to Sarah. Eleanor looked absolutely radiant. She was wearing a comfortable linen blouse, and her sharp, intelligent eyes were filled with a deep sense of peace. The storm had passed, and her family was intact. The dust had finally settled from the most chaotic 6 months of their lives. The divorce proceedings were not a long, drawn-out battle. They were remarkably swift and absolutely brutal for Mark. When Sarah's lawyers walked into the mediation room armed with Eleanor's back-end corporate audits and the private investigator's photographs, the fight was practically over before it even started. Mark, had absolutely zero leverage. "You know," Sarah said, setting her cold glass down on the table, "I finally got the last piece of paperwork from the attorneys yesterday. The deed to the house is officially transferred entirely into my name, and the business equity split is totally finalized." Eleanor smiled, taking a small bite of a lemon cookie. "I knew those lawyers would not let us down. They are the best in the city for a reason. How does it feel to be completely secure, sweetheart?" "It feels unreal," Sarah admitted, a soft, genuine laugh escaping her lips. "I spent 10 years worrying about every single dime we spent. I clipped coupons. I tracked the stock market. I always worried that one bad quarter for the business would leave us out on the street. Now I look at my portfolio and I know the kids and I are going to be fine. My financial future is completely rock solid. I do not have to stress about my retirement anymore." "You earned every single penny of that security," Sarah Eleanor replied, her voice filled with immense respect. "You put in the sweat equity when there was absolutely nothing. You built the foundation. The court simply recognized who the real owner of that wealth always was." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep wave of gratitude wash over her. She had retained primary custody of the children, and she got to keep the beautiful family home they had built together. But the biggest victory was the business. Because Eleanor had originally drafted the seed money loan and the controlling equity in Sarah's name, Mark had absolutely no leg to stand on. The court had essentially forced Mark to buy out Sarah's majority shares at a massive premium just to keep his own company afloat. He was completely drowning in the debt he had created. "Speaking of Mark," Sarah said, her voice totally neutral, devoid of any lingering sadness or anger. "Richard told me he moved out of that motel last week." Eleanor let out a short, completely humorless laugh. "Yes, he finally found a place. He is renting a cramped little studio apartment way out in the suburbs. It is right above a very noisy auto repair shop. It is quite the downgrade from the country club lifestyle he thought he was going to live." Sarah just shook her head slowly. It was hard to believe how fast a person could fall when they let arrogance completely blind them to reality. "Your father-in-law stopped by his office to drop off some mail the other day," Eleanor continued, brushing a cookie crumb off her lap. "Mark is practically sleeping at his desk. He is working 60-hour weeks right now, just trying to keep the lights on and pay your alimony. And to make matters worse, his little performance bonus trick finally caught up with him." Sarah looked over, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "The Internal Revenue Service." "Oh yes," Eleanor said, her eyes sparkling with a hint of absolute satisfaction. "They flagged the corporate accounts about a month ago. You cannot just write off $50,000 diamond bracelets and constant first-class flights to Miami as business consulting expenses. The auditors are completely tearing his books apart. He is going to be paying massive penalties and back taxes for years. His early retirement dream is completely dead and buried." It was the ultimate financial reality check. Mark had tried to cheat the system. He had tried to cheat his family. And he had tried to fund a midlife crisis with money that was meant for his children's future. Now he was broke, exhausted, and living in a tiny apartment while the woman he tried to replace was sitting comfortably in the sunshine, enjoying the exact golden years she had worked so hard to build. As for Tiffany, she had completely vanished into thin air. The moment she realized the money train had officially derailed, she ran back to Florida to find her next wealthy victim. She was just a painful memory now, a temporary parasite that the family had successfully removed before it could cause permanent financial ruin. Sarah looked at the older woman sitting across from her. Eleanor was a force of nature. She was a fiercely protective matriarch who understood that true wealth was about protecting the people you love. Without Eleanor's intervention, Sarah knew she might have walked away with absolutely nothing. Mom Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. I do not think I have ever truly thanked you for what you did that night at the steakhouse. You put your own son on the line to protect me. You saved my life. You saved my children's future. Eleanor stopped rocking in her wicker chair. She reached across the small glass table and placed her warm, steady hand directly over Sarah's. She gave it a firm, comforting squeeze. Her eyes met Sarah's, and the absolute love and fierce loyalty radiating from the older woman was unmistakable. Blood does not make you family, Sarah. Eleanor said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of an unbreakable promise. Loyalty does. You stood by my son when he was nothing. You built a beautiful life for my grandchildren. You are my daughter, and nobody, absolutely nobody, messes with my family's nest egg. Sarah smiled, a single happy tear slipping down her cheek. The afternoon sun felt incredibly warm against her skin. The past 10 years of struggle and betrayal were finally behind her. The safety net was completely secure. The storm was over, and the rest of her life was waiting for her, bright, beautiful, and totally safe. If you loved this story about a strong mother-in-law protecting her family and putting a lying husband exactly in his place, please hit that like button and subscribe to Eva's Whisper right now. We have so many more moving everyday stories about real-life drama, family loyalty, and fighting for what you deserve. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done if you were in Sarah's shoes. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in the next story.